Hello everyone. This course, this module is entitled Biblical Leadership, and I am Will Hesterberg, Chairman of the Board for I.T.E.M and an instructor with I.T.E.M. I've also constructed this particular module, and the reason that I've named it Biblical Leadership is that there's an awful lot of talk, study about leadership, and I would suspect that every pastor probably has a whole shelf full of books on leadership. Problem is that some of those books aren't necessarily biblical. They're the world's ideas about leaders and what leadership looks like and how we develop leaders, that sort of thing. So we're really going to look at leadership from a biblical perspective. For example, here are some of the sessions that we're going to be looking at. Defining leaders and leadership. What do leaders look like? How does God show us what we should be looking for in leaders? Getting to the heart of leading. Leading really is about the heart. If you recall, when God sent Samuel to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the next king after Saul, Jesse had all of his sons pass in front of Samuel, and Samuel looked at the first one, Eliab, and thought, this guy looks pretty good. He's tall, dark, handsome. Of course, that's what a leader should look like. But God says, don't look on the outward appearance, look on the heart. And so there's a crucial principle for us when it comes to leadership, looking for leaders, developing leaders. It's all about the heart. And our third study, The Heart of Leading, is going to really focus on that. We're going to be looking at how leaders are made. They're not born, meaning that leaders are developed. They're not automatic. The world tends to look at leadership as you either have the gift of leading or you don't. And if you don't, you really aren't going to amount to much as a leader. The fifth study is going to be on leading in teams. Leading is not a lone wolf kind of approach. It's about working with other people. Leadership and teamwork at the home and in the church is the sixth study. The seventh is, what do leaders do? What do leaders concern themselves with in the church? The eighth one is on leaders and shepherding. One of the main qualities of a leader is that he is a shepherd, and we're going to look in great detail at Psalm 23, which talks about the Lord as our shepherd, and we're going to learn a lot about shepherding from Jesus' example. The ninth lesson is on leaders teaching and multiplying other leaders. And we're going to look at some principles about teaching. Jesus was a master teacher. And we're told that the leaders within the church should be apt to teach. So we need to develop teachers for our leaders. The 10th one is what leaders must know before they can teach. We're going to be talking about some of the main points of our faith, and that leaders need to be able to pass on the faith. Number 11, what can leaders do when others won't follow? This is going to focus on conflict. Leaders are always going to experience conflict, and that's sometimes why some people don't want to be leaders. They don't like conflict. Conflict can actually be very constructive, and it shouldn't be something that we shy away from. The last one is not only conflict and how we handle conflict, but what about when we're the problem? When we as leaders need to be corrected, how do we handle correction? because how we handle correction really provides a template for others when we bring correction into their lives and we work with them on conflict. So that's kind of an overview of what our study is going to be about. In this first study, defining leaders and leadership, Webster defines a leader as a person who has commanding authority or influence. That's a rather simple, straightforward, unbiased definition to how the world views leadership. If we look at a quick survey of verses in the Bible, they confirm that this is how the world sees leadership. But is that really how we should see leadership? In Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 12, it defines one of the world's first leaders, a man by the name of Nimrod. Nimrod is said to be a mighty hunter. It's interesting that that word for hunter doesn't necessarily mean hunting animals, but hunting other people. And so here's somebody, a leader, intent on imposing his will on others. And it leads to a kind of leadership that forces others to follow against their wills. In Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, we learn about the Tower of Babel and how people gathered together in order to make a name for themselves, to build a monument, a settlement that will draw people's attention to it and will cause people to be impressed by this group of people and look to them for leadership then later on. And in that, we find people who really are intent on self-serving, self-aggrandizement, self-reliance. They are going to build this monument to themselves and make a name for themselves. It's also kind of interesting that later in Genesis 11, we're introduced to Shem, one of the men that's in the line of the Messiah. And the name for Shem, or the word for Shem, means name. It's almost like God is saying, here's two different ways that you can make a name for yourself. You can do it by your own efforts, or you can trust me to give you a name. If we follow that idea in Genesis chapter 12, we see that God is calling Abraham, and he is going to make a name for Abraham. He's going to change his name, in fact. So God is going to make a name for Abraham. He's not going to make a name for himself. The Bible presents a lot of situations in which there is either no leadership or poor leadership. You look at Judges, for example, and you have an example of strong leaders, but leaders who also have their feet of clay, so to speak, who have their own weaknesses. And it's in those weaknesses that they end up not being good leaders, maybe leading the people astray. In Samuel's day, the Israelites are clamoring for a leader, a king, so that they will be like all the other people in the world. And they're not satisfied with God being their leader. They come to Samuel and they tell him, give us a king. Samuel warns them about the dangers of having a human king, but they won't hear that. They want a king. And they are very specific. We want a king like all the other nations have, who will do these things for us. Samuel goes back to God, and God says, give them a king. And so we know that the first king is Saul, and he proves to be a bad king. But on the outward appearance, he looks great. Tall, taller than all the other Israelites, handsome, seems to be humble at first, and then problems begin to appear, cracks in his character, and we know the rest of the story, how he ends up being rejected by God because he won't listen to God. He's going to do things his way. And then God sends Samuel to anoint a new king, and that, of course, is David. We just talked about how Samuel, even as the prophet of God, looks at the sons of Jesse and is drawn to the outward appearance of I.T.E.M, his handsomeness, his height, his good looks, and everything. But we're going to find later in the incident with Goliath that I.T.E.M has his problems. He is short-tempered. He doesn't like other people getting the attention. And so God already knew that. God instead chooses David, a man after his own heart, because he sees David's heart. And we know, of course, from David that he's not perfect. He makes some monumental mistakes. But David was different. David was willing to receive correction, to change, to seek forgiveness, to recognize that he was wrong. That's what made him different from Saul. Now let's move on to some of the New Testament passages that have things to teach us about leaders and leadership. Let's start with Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 28. Here, Jesus challenges his disciples to look at leadership different from the rest of the world and the way that the world looks at leaders. He says the world looks at leaders as people to exercise authority and power, to use it for their own benefit, and perhaps to use it as a force to make others obey them. Jesus challenges them and says, you're not to be like that. You're to look at leadership differently. In fact, you're to look at leaders as servants. And then he points to himself as the example that he came not to he came not to be served, but to serve. And so he challenges them to a different view of leadership. Jesus does that again on the last night before he's betrayed, where you remember they're in the upper room, they're about to have the Last Supper, and Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. Perhaps he noticed that they were not about to do that for each other. And so Jesus humbles himself and puts on the appropriate clothing and washes their feet one by one. And he says to them, you call me Master, Lord, and you're right for saying that, but I'm among you as one who serves. And he challenges them that they're to follow his example now. And in following his example, that they will actually demonstrate genuine love to the people around them. So it's a different view of leadership. Paul refers to Jesus' example in Philippians chapter 2. He challenges the people in the Philippian church. He says, you need to have a certain kind of attitude. You need to have the kind of attitude that Christ had. For example, how Christ came, laying aside his glory, his power, all of his prerogatives, in order to become a servant, even to the point of dying on a cross. He didn't look at the things that he had as something to grab a hold of, to grasp, to hold on to, but gave them up in order to be able to serve God and to accomplish God's plan of salvation. And then the passage goes on to say how God exalts him for his obedience. So exaltation, getting attention, being recognized as important people is not the goal of a leader. It's to serve. It's to trust God if God decides to raise him up at some point. In Romans chapter 12, after laying out all of the theology of salvation, as Paul does in the first 11 chapters, he then proceeds in chapter 12 to get to the application. And what is one of the applications? To not be conformed to the way of the world, but to be transformed by God's Word. And part of that is to be transformed in their view of being leaders, using the gifts that God has given them, gifts of service, gifts of helps, and gifts of administration, and things like that. Paul is going to be advocating that people need to look for leaders who care about doing God's work, who care about God's kingdom rather than their own kingdom. Paul now will move into 1 Corinthians, and in Corinth, the people had a real issue with leadership. Right away in the first chapter, they're arguing over which leader they're following. Some are following Paul, some are following Peter, some are following others. And Paul challenged them and says, you're looking at this totally wrong. You need to be followers of Christ. And you need to remember that God doesn't pay attention to popularity or great abilities, that he actually chooses the ordinary, the weak of the world. Why? In order that he might get the glory and the honor. People would see Christians doing the work of the kingdom, and they would marvel not at those people's abilities, but rather at how God was using them and blessing them in their service. I think of an example that happened in my own life. As I was going to high school, we had a young man in our class by the name of Sylvan. Now, Sylvan was quiet, shy. He didn't speak much in class, and perhaps part of that was that he would get embarrassed and he would perhaps get his tongue all tangled up. And so he very seldom raised his hand, very seldom spoke in class. After we all graduated, we went our different ways. And Sylvan and I ended up working in the same nursing home. I as a maintenance man, him as an orderly. In the second year, as we came home from college to work during the summer, I overheard someone say, "Hey, did you hear about Sylvan? He's become a Christian." "No, that's great." "Yes, and he is going to be preaching at his home church this next week." And I thought to myself, Sylvan preaching? Really? That's interesting. I think I really want to go hear him. And I did. Sylvan gave one of the clearest, most powerful presentations of the gospel that I've heard. And it was clear that it wasn't Sylvan who was preaching. It was God using Sylvan. And so God got the glory. And I think that's how God looks at leadership. He wants to work through men and women who aren't flashy, but who are ordinary, perhaps even weak in some ways, so that people hear them and watch them serving God and recognize there's something else going on here. That's not so-and-so. There's something supernatural happening here. And God gets the glory. That's really what God is after in choosing leaders, men and women, who will give Him the glory instead of taking it for themselves. Later on in chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, Paul is going to ask a pretty challenging question. He says, what do you have that you did not receive? And if you received it, then why do you boast? If we have talents, if we have abilities, if we have gifts of leadership, where did they come from? They came from God. And so it's not something that we can take credit for. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, there's a wonderful verse where Paul says, for we do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves as Jesus' servants. So as we are serving, who are we preaching? Who are we putting forward? Who are we focusing on? Who is the center of what we're doing? Is it Christ or is it us? That's very crucial in leadership. Later in Philippians 2, Paul is going to point to two other examples of servant leaders besides Christ, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And he talks about how they were willing to sacrifice themselves for Paul's benefit and for the ministry to the Philippians. Chapter later, in Philippians chapter 3, Paul recounts his own story of how he achieved some real notoriety. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was a very righteous man. He was well known in the upper Jewish circles of leadership and power. But he says, I'm willing to throw them away. In fact, not just throw them away, but to consider them as garbage because I found Christ. Christ is better. Christ is what I want to focus on. And if we're going to be leaders, that's what we need to focus on too. Not on ourselves, but totally on Him. Paul is going to be writing later to Timothy a couple of letters, and in the first letter, in chapter 3, Paul lays out the qualities, the qualifications of leaders. We'll be getting into that in greater depth in our next session. But if you look at those qualities, you'll see that they're really focused on gentleness, compassion, humility, those sorts of things. And when we look for leaders, those are the qualities and the qualifications that we need to keep in mind. Peter talks about leaders in his first letter, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And he says that if we are looking to be leaders, we should look to be shepherds. Shepherds serve. Shepherds humble themselves. Shepherds were probably one of the more humble of vocations in New Testament times. Very few people wanted to be shepherds, and they looked down on shepherds. But God uses that analogy of shepherds powerfully, and we're going to be looking at that. I think it's in session chapter 8, about how leaders are to be shepherds just as Christ was the good shepherd. Peter is going to be emphasizing grace and trusting God and praying for God's help in order to be humble as leaders. Now, that's a brief survey of some of the key passages in the Old and the New Testament regarding leadership and developing leaders. What I would like you to think about right now is, what is your definition of leadership and of leaders? I'm sure your culture has its own particular understanding of leaders and leadership. but given these passages, it might be interesting for you to develop your own description of a leader. And then once you have done that, were you surprised by anything that you discovered in this initial study of these different passages? Let's bring it a little bit more closer to home. For yourself, where do you see the areas that you need God's help for you to grow to become a better leader in your church and among your people? So try working on that for the next study. Thank you very much for tuning in for this first session of Biblical Leadership. Goodbye.